And I am here with a special guest today. It's Carmel Harrington, and we are going to be talking about her brand new novel that comes out in February, The Stolen Child. Thank you so much for joining me today, Carmel.
It's an absolute pleasure, Ray. Thanks for having me.
Um, I read this. I have to be honest, I am not a big thriller reader. I tend to read a lot of mysteries, a lot of murder
Yeah,
mysteries and cozy crime. And this one's a bit of an odd one in that there's no real deaths or anything, but I would
yeah,
say that I'd class it personally as more of a thriller in style.
yeah,
So could you tell everybody out there who hasn't already read it, or maybe some who have,
yeah,
what The Stolen Child is about?
yeah. Well, that's so. Thank you. It's been referred to as an emotional thriller, or domestic thriller. That's kind of the tag that it's got from some of the reviews that have come in already, and I think that kind of works because it is quite an emotional story. It's with three timelines, and it moves between the 1960s in London, the 1980s in Spain and Ireland, and the present day in Spain and Ireland. And the story centers around the Murphy family, mother Kimberley, dad Jason, and they've two children, 2.5-year-old Robert and 6-month-old Lily. And they are on a family cruise in 1983, and they are docked just off the coast of Barcelona. And they wake up, and when they wake up from their one-room family cabin, 2.5-year-old Robert has disappeared, and he's literally vanished overnight. And so, despite frantically searching, the Spanish police are involved, but he's never found. And that's not a plot spoiler because pretty much that's what happens, like as soon as the story sets off. And the story then is told over a number of timelines. And Lily, who is Robert's little sister, when she's grown up and she's a family of her own, she takes over the story then as she tries to uncover what really happened to her brother, because this has been the consequences of his disappearance has stayed with her family and has had devastating consequences for the dynamics of her family. And then she takes a new client on. She's a psychotherapist, and Zach from America comes in. He's been having trouble sleeping, but he comes with a shocking theory about what he thinks has happened to Robert all those years ago. And really, it's Lily and Zach working together to try and unravel the secrets and the mysteries of the 1980s, and somebody doesn't want the truth to come out. So that's really what the story is. So it's about a missing child and about a family's search for that missing child, which takes you through, well, actually 6 decades in the end.
That was it. I think that you're right. It is definitely an emotional thriller because there are so many consequences, and you see the massively detrimental effects that everything that occurred in the 1980s has had on Lily's life, on her parents' lives, and the way that Lily is so desperate to move on, but then she's presented with this immediate sort of return to all those things, and she's trying almost to protect her family from them because her parents have already separated, and there seems to be um I don't know if I'm misreading, but there seems to be a lot of animosity between her mum Kimberly and her dad Jason, but more
Yeah,
as
it's a
though
very
she's
complicated.
resentful of the fact that he can't move on.
There's, I think, for their relationship, when I was writing it, they have this really great love story. They really fell in love in the 80s when they met. They fell desperately in love. And Kimberly was a single mom. She had a 6-month-old little boy, Robert, when she meets Jason. And they have an instant attraction, and they get married and then go on to have Lily very, very quickly. So it's a great love story between them. But as we know, and we see this all the time when we hear about real life um, issues where children are taken or go missing or come to harm, it's hard for a family to get through that. And quite often there are casualties of a child going missing. And not all marriages make it. In fact, more often than not, they don't. So it felt quite authentic to me. When I was writing the story, I thought for lots of times, would they stay together but be quite fractured and broken, but they're still together, or should they be apart? And in the end, I decided it was actually better for the story that they're apart, but they keep being drawn back to each other. So they have a very complicated relationship. There's still great love, but Jason cannot get over the loss of his stepson, and he is obsessed with finding out what happened, because the finger of suspicion has always been pointed at him. Has he had some involvement in something happening to his stepson? And then for Kimberley, she can't get over the loss of her son. She feels guilt because she feels she should have done more to save him, to keep him. And so their relationship is the casualty of that, really. And then Lily, as the surviving member of the family, I felt it was really interesting to explore her, because I feel the weight and the responsibility of being the surviving child would be um, very, very heavy. And I really wanted to explore that when I wrote the story. So she has almost become the intermediary. She feels very much that she has to be in between her mum and dad and keep the peace. And sometimes they can have wonderful moments together as a family, but more often than not, the subject of Robert comes up, the missing child, the stolen child, and then all of a sudden then
It
carnage
all falls
happens,
apart.
and she's left to pick up the pieces.
There have been a lot of films and books that have covered the guilt. It's almost survivor's guilt on the part of the remaining
Absolutely.
child, the one who hasn't been taken and is still
Yes.
there. So that seems to be something that, well, it does come across quite well with Lily, that she does feel that element of guilt, and as though she's been punished because she's the one that was left behind, the one that wasn't taken, because her parents became very overprotective and wouldn't allow her to do all these things. And so I imagine that it would have been quite hard growing up in that circumstance. But obviously we don't get to see her growing up. We go straight from the moment that she's a 6-month-old baby, probably 7 or 8 months by the time they move back from Spain to Ireland, to an adult with her own young child and a husband and a marriage that could potentially be damaged by the events that occur in the present day. Yeah, I
No, sorry,
found the
go on. No,
story that we had with Sally and Elsie also very interesting.
yeah, that was actually one of my favorite parts to write, actually. And it it wasn't meant to be as big a part of the story. Like initially, when I was developing the characters, and so for people listening, Sally and Elsie, their story starts in the 1960s, and both of them have ended up in an orphanage in London. And really, the story is told more from the point of view of Sally. When she's 4 years old, her mother just decides that she has to hand her over to social services, and she ends up in an orphanage. And we don't really find out why until much later on in the story.
Mm.
So we won't go into that because it would be like a plot spoiler. But she is so confused and so vulnerable and so scared. A social worker picks her up, and one minute she's at home and her mother is brushing her hair, and the next minute she's in the back of a car being taken to this orphanage. And it's a terrifying experience for her. But when she goes there, she's taken under the wing of a girl who's a couple of years older than her, Elsie, who's been at the orphanage for several years already. And they just make this sisterhood. They become best friends. They become sisters in every way but blood. And Elsie looks out for her, but also Sally looks out for Elsie, because Sally gives Elsie something that she's never had, and that's love. And so they are so united together. And initially, I wrote it was to be a flashback, because I wanted, for my own self, when I create characters, I need to understand their motivations, and I need to understand what has led them to behave in a certain way. And so, in order for me to make sense of why they do certain things in the book, I needed to explore this. And I really wanted to explore Sally in particular. And I was thinking, okay. And as I wrote a scene with Sally in the orphanage, and I actually cried as I wrote it, because it was very poignant, very, very sad. It was a heartbreaking moment for her. And I thought, there's definitely more to the story I need to explore. So before I knew it, I had written several chapters, and I knew then that this was a bigger part of the story. So their friendship, I think, and their sisterhood is very, very important, because as the story unfolds later on in the book, we go back to that to understand how we ended up where we ended up. But yeah, it was quite interesting. And that period of time, the 60s and 70s in London, it was an interesting time to delve into. And I was lucky. My mum and dad, and my mum is from London. My dad is from Wexford in Ireland, where I'm from. But my dad left Wexford to go to London, met my mother. And so their shared experiences as a young couple and then getting married was in the late 60s and the 70s. So I had this great input from them. They could give me some, some cracking stories, which I used in the book. Actually, it was great to have that first-hand lived experience in London. So that was quite fun to write.
Absolutely. I found that the storyline in the 1960s and the early 1970s could have been a book on its own, because so much happened to these two characters and the experiences they have from the orphanage to the revelations of her mother and the career that she builds for herself and meeting her husband. And obviously Elsie's experiences are very, very different from hers when she first leaves the orphanage.
Absolutely.
And she does hint at them, but she never outright states, this is what I had to do to survive. There's those little undercurrents of understanding why certain things happened that Sally will never have, because Elsie was out there looking out for her.
Well, this is it. And when I wrote the story, actually, because there are three very distinct timelines, what I do is I actually write each timeline independently. So I wrote the 1960s to the 1970s, well, right up until the early 80s, really. And that was almost like a novella in itself. I wrote the present day, and then I wrote the 1980s, the scenes that happen on the cruise ship when Robert goes missing, and the scenes that happen in Barcelona as the search goes on for Robert. And so when I was finished, I ended up, my first draft, I had 140,000 words. So it was too long, it was too big. So then you have the trouble of then you're trying to decide which bits to keep, which are important to the story. And it had to be, it would have been, we could have done, I think the first draft of the 1960s part, Sally and Elsie's story, was about 70,000 words, which is a short novel, right? It could have been, but we had to cut that down and we had to make it, it ended up about 40,000 words. So you have to decide which of the parts that I'm going to keep, which of the parts are important to the story. And chapters became a couple of sentences. So you'd have to say, okay, I remember I did a whole chapter on Sally's first date with who eventually becomes her husband. And again, we won't say too much because we don't want any spoilers. And she goes on a double date then with Elsie and her boyfriend. And I ended up having to lose that because the pace in the middle of the book, it was just, while it was a really good chapter and I really loved it, but it was slowing down the story. And the ultimate aim of the story was always, we need to find out what happened to Robert all those years ago and why did it happen to him. And so I had to kind of stay true to that. So you have to kind of go, so I ended up then that Sally just recalls that first date in a couple of sentences as opposed to a whole chapter. And they were the decisions I had to make as a writer, like what do I really want to happen here? And it meant then, and unless I had made it into two books and I didn't want to do that, it had to be kind of tighter, and I kind of hope that it kept the pace clipping along for readers. That was the aim.
Really. I think that's the thing. It does definitely, because you have got that point where you start at the beginning of the book and obviously you've got what happens on the cruise ship, and then you've got the bits about Sally and Elsie, and that brings it up to the present day. And the pace goes really well. I remember the scene you're talking about with the referral to the date that wasn't great. But the story as it goes, the story covers a lot of different subjects, because obviously there's domestic abuse in there, which was horrifying to read.
Yes,
and you created these characters that were so complex. I mean, the relationship between Sally and her husband is so complicated and so detailed that you can imagine actually having this conversation with somebody who's gone through these things, but she seems so reticent to actually discuss it or admit it. And that is so true.
And you see, you've got to think about it's the time that we were in at that time as well.
Yeah.
And so I had to be true, because now we have a lot more conversations around domestic abuse now. And but back in the 70s and the 80s, it was like a hidden subject, right? It was something that people didn't talk about, and it took a lot to actually admit that maybe your marriage wasn't working, or that somehow or other you were to blame if this was happening. And it was quite an isolating thing. And I did a lot of research, I did a lot of interviews, and it's a subject I've covered before in a previous novel, actually, domestic abuse. And I went to a women's aid centre where and it was actually the thing that you find out from everybody, the kind of the connecting thing that have been through this, is this feeling of self-blame, that somehow it's my fault that I've allowed this to happen. And then that stops you then for looking for help, because if it's my fault, well, then I don't deserve help. Then this, and it becomes a prison. Like you actually become imprisoned in this cycle of abuse, and it's really tricky. So that storyline with Sally and Ian, it was difficult to write, but it was really important to write, because again, understanding all of that, when all the secrets are revealed at the end of the novel. So when you get to the end and you have, that there's a big scene at the end where all the characters meet up and all of the answers are revealed. But none of those answers would have made sense if you didn't know about all of that. So the reader had to experience those things firsthand. So that was why, for example, I lost the first date, but we couldn't lose those scenes with Ian for the early marriage. You needed those to witness them and have the shock of, again, I'm just trying to be careful now with spoilers, but we've now mentioned domestic abuse. But the first scene of domestic abuse is so shocking to the character, but it's very shocking for the reader too, because you're kind of thinking maybe this marriage is not going to be everything that I want, but that first slap is like, and it is a shock. And it's deliberately done as that because you want the reader to feel it at the same time as Sally almost, so it's quite an immersive moment, I hope, for readers.
Yeah.
But it's a difficult subject to write about. It's not an easy subject to write about at all.
As you said, during that period of time, it wasn't something that you would discuss with anybody, because as you said, you had that inward, I blame myself, it was me, was it something I did, I shouldn't have said that, I shouldn't have done that, I didn't have their dinner on the table. And then you look, it sounds weird, but when I was reading that, I thought about the Den and Angie Watts relationship right at the very beginning of EastEnders.
Yeah, no, you're right, actually, when you think about that, actually. And actually it's gas, because I don't watch EastEnders now as an adult, but as a kid
I watched it as a kid though.
Isn't it so true? But you know what I've been seeing on TikTok, actually? It's some anniversary. It must be
it's
30
the 40th.
Or 40. So the anniversary, they're showing loads of clips, and I've been finding myself looking at the old clips because they're the ones I remember as a kid. And I just saw a clip of Angie and Den, and it was quite shocking to see. I was like, oh my God, that was a very abusive relationship between them. But he was the charmer. Like, everybody thought that everybody loved Den because Den was the child. Oh, my darling, and he was so lovely. But really,
and Angie was the alcoholic that everyone thought was a joke.
Was she and why was she an alcoholic? Anyhow, it was it's interesting you say that. I'd never thought of that, but you're quite right. But what I had to do is you have to think about that it was a very different time, and so the reactions and the way the characters behave is relevant for that period of time. And the other thing to point out is, as well, in at that period of time, a lot of women, when they got married, they had to stop working, and that's what happened. Like when my mother married my dad, she was working in the bank and she had to give up her job because that was the law. She wasn't allowed to be married and work in the bank. And isn't that shocking? Like, so she had to give up her career when she got married, full stop. And, thankfully that's not the case anymore. But so women lost a lot of independence. Marriage meant that you lost independence and you had to become Susie Homemaker, having the dinner on the table. And the power, the imbalance of power is really what's at the heart of that issue, and at the heart of the problem for Sally, where she finds herself, all of a sudden she's lost her voice, lost her power, and she's in a very difficult situation, a very scary situation, really.
And not only that, she never had any strong male role models in her life growing up. So she wouldn't necessarily realize that this is not a healthy relationship. This might be the thing that's going on behind every single closed door that she walks past.
There you go.
But all she knows, it's normal. And I
There you
mean,
go.
I grew up in the
Yeah.
70s and early 80s. I I was around when EastEnders premiered. I feel old. But
Well,
it's
same
one of those
here.
things,
With the same timeline, you and I. Yeah.
yeah. And you look at these things, and it's kind of like one of my favorite books when I was growing up was a book called Easy Connections by Liz Berry. And reading it as an adult, it is
Yeah.
about assault,
Wow.
gaslighting, bribery, blackmail, and control, and
Wow.
a power imbalance because she's a 17-year-old girl and he's a 29-year-old rock star.
Okay.
And that was the
Okay.
kind of books that they were marketing to teenage girls in the 80s.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it just makes you
That's mad.
realize how things are. I'd say they're really, really different, but then you read some of the YA books these days and think, "Ugh,
Yeah.
they're going back to that."
Yeah.
But we're far more aware of it now. We're far more aware
Yeah.
that this is a problem.
Yeah.
That's a massive, great big red flag.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
the thing is, you do think, oh, I'll never get into that situation. I'm strong and independent. Yet you know that there are loads of women who are in the same situation that Sally was, but they have far more ways out
That's it.
if they have the
That's it, right?
confidence and courage to do it.
That's it. Yeah.
I mean,
Absolutely.
Sally couldn't see a way out of her situation, and that was what was so horrifying about her timeline that
Yeah.
really made
That's
you
it.
feel for her.
Yeah. It was. It was a scary time for her. There's no doubt about it. Quite a claustrophobic a time for her as well. You know, she was very much locked in every sense of the word, not just in her home, but in her mind. In her life became very, very small, and
Which
that's
is, but she had some very good
the reality.
friends.
She does. The friends were great, actually. I mean, yeah, it was really interesting. I wanted to kind of create this sisterhood and this network, this community for her, and the friendships come from obviously Elsie from the home, and while there are moments in the orphanage that are not great, which again, from my research, is unfortunately how it was at that time period. But there were my research also showed me that while there were horrifying moments for people who were in care, there were also lots of very good moments, and it was down to the people. You know, if you were lucky enough to have the right person. Um, and Sister Ailsa, Sister
Yes.
Jones, is this nun that runs the orphanage, and she's a very benevolent character and plays an important part in Sally's life, as does Nicola when her employer, and she also becomes a very dear friend and almost like a surrogate mother for her. So while there are some terrible moments in the story and there are some terrible people in the story, there are good people too. And I think that's
Yeah.
true life. I think for all of us, we all at times in our life come across the villains, and but thankfully most of our life is full of heroes, everyday heroes that are just
Yeah.
doing their best. And those small kindnesses that people do for you, and they can be the smallest of things. They're the things that keep you going and that let you put one foot in front of the other when everything goes wrong, you know. So that sisterhood was really interesting to develop, and I've always been really keen on that, actually. I love exploring families that we are not born into. I think it's so important for us all to kind of acknowledge that they can be as important and sometimes more important than the families that we're born into, because not everybody is lucky enough to be born into a great family. And um when I think about
That's
when
the
I first
thing.
went to Dublin when I was
This is a
18,
story of
there were
found family.
it is found family. That's it. And like, I know that, you know, as I said, when I was 18 and I went to Dublin, there were times where I was my wages were terrible, but I was never going to starve because I could always, you know, call home. But for it was very different for Sally and for Elsie, because when they left their orphanage at 18, they're on their own. And there was no family to fall back on. So when things got tough, as they did, because poverty is one of the themes that is explored in this story, and when you are really poor, and I don't mean that you just don't have enough money to go for a drink, I mean, like, you know, that you don't have money to put food on the table, and your back is really against a wall. What do you have to do to survive? And again, without, I don't really want to go into what they have to do, but the things that Sally and Elsie in particular have to do to survive, and that's very much part, and it colors as well their life story. And again, as I said, when you get all the answers, all of those are very relevant. You know, they all kind of lead you to that, to those moments where decisions were made that maybe will haunt them for years to come.
Yeah,
I'm being
and
very
I think
mysterious. I'm
that's
being very careful about what I say.
yeah, that I think that's the thing with this part, with that particular part of the book, is highlighting the fact that the welfare state as it is now did not exist then. I mean,
Yeah.
my father sadly passed away when I was 11, and my mum was left with 3 children, 11, 11 and under, to care for on her
Hard.
own. And financially, the support was not there. We
No.
didn't even qualify for school years.
It's
It's
terrible, isn't
insane.
it? Oh my God.
Yeah, it's
No, it's
absolutely
insane.
insane. And I think, as you said, this highlights that sort of imbalance when it comes to the finance and support that they have. They literally given £20 and, oh, we found a flat for you, but it's an absolute dump, and you've now got to find a job because there is nothing else. And
Yeah, this is it.
it's horrifying when you think they're leaving a home that they've lived in with minimal support and the basics for their entire lives. They're going out into the world. They have got very, very few qualifications, if any, and no support to fall back on if they fall on hard times. So the found family that you brought into it with Nicola and Elsie coming back into the picture is exactly what Sally needs. But Elsie also needs Sally because she needs her almost
Yeah.
as an emotional support.
She's never had love. Like that was kind of, there was a scene that I wrote, and I remember kind of feeling it was quite powerful. It's only a small scene, but it's where Sally gives Elsie a present for the first time when they're in the orphanage, and like nobody has ever given Elsie a gift before, and that's just a really telling thing, that she's grown up without great love in her life. So while Sally has ended up in care for the first 4 years of her life, she felt loved by her mother. Her mother might have been have issues and had made mistakes or whatever, but she did feel love, like, you know, which is why I wrote a scene as well. It's just, it ended up in memory, but between Sally and her mother, where she remembers this scene where her mother brushed her hair. And that was important because there's care, you know, when you brush a child's hair. And I used to do it before my daughter, she's very long curly hair. So before she'd go to bed, you take the time to kind of prepare her head for bed, because then she'd wake up the next day, wouldn't have all the tangles. And so,
Yeah,
but there was so much love with every stroke of the brush for me, and it was a real bonding moment. Amelia would sit between my legs, and I would do her hair and put it in a loose plait so that she could go to bed, and the tangle monster wouldn't come. Um, so I kind of gave that as a scene for Sally and her mum, and then we had to shorten it, but it's still there, but a shortened version of it again, because the novel was going to end up to be like a tomb, really. It was so long. But those moments are very important too. But so Sally had that. She remembered what it was like to have love, which is why she could give love. So that's why she was a lot more emotionally available at the beginning. Whereas for Elsie, she didn't have that. So all of a sudden she's like, okay, what's going on here? So she was able to take that from Sally, which was quite nice. You know, they both
yeah,
are damaged in many ways. And it's how, like, when I started writing this book, one of the sentences I wrote down, that I kept at the top of the manuscript and I would look at every day, was that, you know, we all wear masks to hide the traumas of our past, but what happens when those masks come off? And I kept that all the way through, and I thought about that because every single character has to wear a mask in some shape or form in the story. So for Lily, for example, she wears the mask when she's with each parent. So she wears one mask with Jason and she wears another mask with Kimberley, because her parents have different expectations and needs for her. So she has to wear a mask. And then when she's with her own child, she puts another mask on because she doesn't want her child to see her trauma from her childhood and the fact that her little baby or her older brother, you know, went missing. So everybody wears it, and everybody is wearing a mask to some degree. And I thought it was really, that was for me kind of the core of this novel that I wanted to explore. Sally wears a mask, Elsie wears a mask, Kimberly does, Jason, they're all wearing masks. and some are better at taking them off and revealing their true selves than others, and that was interesting for me.
The only time I think I felt Lily took her mask off was when she was with her grandfather, because he
That's actually
understood
so
where
true.
she was coming from.
100%, and you've hit the nail on the head. He was a really important, actually, we talked about him a lot, actually, because Kevin, again, he's in a couple of chapters,
Yeah.
and other than that, he's in the background of some of the other chapters, but he's really 2 chapters where they're really his kind of, not written in his point of view, but he features prominently in them. And when we were looking at cuts, because as I said, we needed to make it a bit tighter, and one of the things I did toy with, I thought, right, there's a scene, when people read it, they'll remember this maybe. There's no spoilers in this, I promise you, but Lily goes to visit her grandfather at his home. And I did kind of go, maybe I could lose that, but I felt it was really important, because exactly what you said, that scene, while it might seem on the surface, like, why do we need to know a little bit more about Kevin and where he lives? He's in, this retirement village, but it was about showing Lily without her mask. And you're so insightful that you got that. So the scene was very important, because we got to see Lily's true self with him, because she has that, with grandparents. If you're lucky enough to have had the love of a grandparent, and I was brought up, my grandfathers unfortunately had passed, but my grandmothers were so important to me. And you have that unconditional love that you could say to them, oh God, Nanny, I murdered someone. Oh shit, God help you, it wouldn't be your fault to do that at all. Come on till I make you a cup of tea and make you a sandwich. And that love that you get from a grandparent, it's so different, it's unconditional. And I wanted that for Lily. So the love that she feels from her parents is conditional. The conditions are, you must protect yourself, you must not hurt yourself, you must not disappear, you must take my side when I'm fighting with your father, you must take my side when I'm fighting with your mother. All these conditions are there for Lily when she's with her mum and dad. But when she's with her grandfather, there's no conditions. The only condition is he's worried about her and he wants to make sure she's okay. So that's why he stayed for those reasons, actually.
I think that though he was, as you said, in only a few scenes, he does offer a lot, because obviously when everything happens and their young son Ben disappears, it is about, he turns up to support his son in the whole situation, because as you
100%.
said, all fingers were pointing at him, because he
Yeah,
was the
no, he is.
stepdad and he'd been
Yeah.
seen shouting at him that day. I mean, it's a very interesting case in general. And there was that
But
fear as I was reading through, oh God, they're going to find his body, or he's going to have drowned. All of those things went through my head, because they were on a ship.
well, this is the thing. Like, the thing with step parents, I've actually explored that in a lot more detail, actually, in another novel, A Mother's Heart, which is about a custody battle between a stepmother and grandparents. So the story for that book actually is where a young stepmother is the only parent 2 children have had, because tragically their mother died when they were very, very young, and their father remarried. They only remember the stepmother as their mother, and to them she's their mother, full stop, but she's their stepmother. Then their dad tragically dies,
Oh
and
God.
all of a sudden you have the stepmother and her 2 kids, and the dead mother's parents, the grandparents, then go, well, okay, we could put up with this when our son-in-law was alive, but now he's gone. They're kind of going, there's no blood here. And the question is really exploring what makes a parent, how important is blood versus, and there are a lot of, and the reason I wanted to explore that is because I'm a stepmother myself, and I do know that there are so many stereotypical baddies in literature, and also
Cinderella.
movies and TVs. Every single Disney, every single baddie and Wicked Witch in Disney characters are stepmothers. And it was actually when my stepdaughter was 4, we were in Disneyland Paris, and we were in Sleeping Beauty's castle. And as you walk around there, I did French in school, and I was translating the story for Eva, my stepdaughter. And then we got to the bit of the wicked stepmother, and like literally we started to giggle, and the 2 of us were giggling, and we got the fit of the giggles. We could not stop giggling, because it was her first time kind of realizing this phrase, the wicked stepmother. So it became a joke with us. And I used to say to her, every single day. I promised to only be a little bit wicked. And she'd think that was so funny. You know, she just thought that was really, and it was just a really sweet thing that we had between us. But when I decided to write that book, A Mother's Heart, I really looked at it and I was trying to find examples of positive step parents. And it was so A Mother's Heart is it's another suspenseful family drama with thriller, you know, family thriller,
Yeah.
I suppose, domestic thriller. But when I wrote that, I very much wanted to write, it's not a plot twist, but you know from the beginning that the stepmother is a good person, and that was it. I was like unequivocally non-apologetic about the fact that I wanted to write a step parent who was good. The thing with Jason is, in The Stolen Child, you're not entirely sure, because nobody knows what happened to Robert, right? And there has to be a question mark. I wanted there to be fingers. I want the reader to have doubt and be confused, but also have doubt and go, I'm trying to work this out. Who's did it? And so while Jason is actively dedicating his life to find his missing child, that doesn't necessarily mean he doesn't know what's happened, because people will do that. It's the double bluff. So I want readers to be kind of asking questions all the way along, like, you know, what, he's obsessive about this and he's dedicated. Is that guilt that's driving that, or is it a need to find the truth? So there's all sorts of
Is he trying to hide what really happened by pretending,
and this
by
is the thing.
faking innocence?
Yeah. And that's what I want the reader to kind of be thinking as they're going through it. And also, again, I can't, like, there's so many things I'd love to be able to say, but I can't. But
Yep.
there are, I deliberately have written it at the beginning of the book that you are going, she's given me all the answers. Like, this is like, what's going to happen? Like, I've only got to a third of the book and I know what's happened here, but that you see, you don't. You think you know what the answer is, and then all of a sudden the first kind of reveal happens just about a third of, or maybe almost halfway into the book. There's quite a big reveal and it takes the rug out of everything. Okay, well, how can this be? And this doesn't make sense, because I thought X was the answer, but now X isn't the answer. What is going on? And I wanted to do that the whole way through it, because in order to make it, you know, an interesting, satisfying read for the reader, it had to kind of keep you guessing all the way through, right till kind of almost the end, when all the stories kind of come out, you know, when everything is revealed. But yeah, the step parent thing is always interesting, because it's very easy to be the baddie. And I had that myself. I did a TV show for years in Ireland. It's kind of Ireland's version of Loose Women, and I was one of the regular panelists on it. And I never really spoke about, I was very careful about what I would talk about, and I would never really speak about my stepdaughter, because while I would talk about my own kids, I was always very private about keeping her identity, because that was her choice and all that kind of stuff. But I mentioned, something came up about step parents, and I said very little, but I said I'm a stepmother, and I said whatever, I said a few sentences. I actually got hate mail. So that I
Why?
would still remember, seriously, I remember I would get, you know, mail would go to the studio rather than to me. And usually it's people who've read my books, and then they'd see you on TV, and then they'd send you a lovely letter saying, oh, I love this book, or whatever. It meant so much to me. So I had never received hate mail before. And I saw this letter, and it was kind of that spidery script writing. And I remember thinking, it was quite a thick envelope. So there's about 6 pages, front and back,
Same.
basically telling me how evil I was, that I had basically ruined a child's life, that I had broken up a marriage. I didn't. I met my husband and he was single. He just happened to have a 3-year-old daughter. So there was no, my hands were clean. I did nothing. I just loved a child. That was what I was guilty of. I met my husband, fell in love with him, fell in love with his daughter, and became a bonus mother, is how we have always called it, because she already has a lovely mother and I'm just the bonus mother. And it was just a very lovely relationship. But somebody who knew nothing, the only thing I said was that I'm a stepmother, and they just made an assumption. Well, that must mean that I'm an evil person, because if you're a stepmother, that means you must have had an affair, you must have broken up a happy life, and you are actively being mean to a child. That was the response from a very.
Okay, had they been assessed?
Well, they must. I mean, obviously, it was like, and I remember at the time, though, it was really, you take a minute and you read it and you digest it, and you're like, okay, do I throw it in the fire? Do I? But it was really, it got me now, I have to say, really. But what I remember about it is, I remember thinking, okay, what do I do with this? And I could have, I shared something on, it was probably on Facebook. I don't think I was on Instagram with it. It was before Instagram. But I remember kind of saying, I've got this letter, and I held it up. I didn't talk about what was in it, but I just said the way I respond to hate mail is this. And I said nothing. So I just kind of I thought, whoever you are, you're watching, I'm not going to give air, I'm not going to give oxygen to your hate, basically. Because I've always believed that if you have nothing good to say, well, then shut your mouth. Like, do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
You don't
I
need
agree
to,
with you completely.
you know, and
It
it says more about whoever that person is. But it did actually make me realize that there is this bias, like such a bias towards step parents. And it's unfortunate because as children, that's ingrained into us with every fairy tale. So from the moment we are sitting in the laps of our parents or our grandparents or whoever, and stories are being read to us, those fables, those fairy tales are all telling us one thing: a step parent is bad, a step parent is evil, a step parent is not to be trusted, a step parent doesn't have your best interests at heart. And that can be the case, because I do know that for every, you know, 9 people who say, you know, "Oh, I was fine with my step parent," one will say, "You will not believe what happened to me." And I get that, like, you know, that's, I'm not saying
Yeah,
that every step parent is good, but every step parent is not bad. That's the message really here, you know.
I think the thing that has always baffled me about fairy tales and stories in general, where they talk about the
Mm,
step parents, it's very
mm.
rarely a stepfather.
Yeah, it's true, actually.
You look at
It's true.
fairy tales, it's stepmother in Cinderella,
It's true.
stepmother in Snow White.
Yeah.
Where's the stepfathers? So they're saying essentially, oh, the mothers always die first. Though there are statistics that prove that a married woman dies before her husband, but a single woman will last longer than a single man.
That's interesting. That's
It was
interesting.
interesting because I'm a single woman. It's quite
Yeah,
interesting to see that a single man will last less time than I will, but if I'm married, he'd last longer than me.
because you're doing everything basically. There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I know. It's so interesting, isn't it? It's so
It is
interesting.
very interesting how from the perspective of a fairy tale, it's always an evil woman rather than an
Mm,
evil man. Even
mm.
Maleficent's a woman, and
Yeah,
she's not a
yeah,
step anything. But
yeah,
it is one of those things that I find very interesting. And I also found it interesting because at the back of the book, you mentioned how you came up with the idea for this story.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It is very much so. This story has my family's DNA written all over it, really, you know. And I get inspiration for stories in many different ways, right? Like I really do. But this particular one came from one of those horrifying what if moments that families sometimes have. And I think that most parents will have at least one occasion where they can say, I was in the shopping centre and my child went missing, and for 5 minutes I thought they were gone. And everybody has a story. I have those. But we had one kind of even further. We had gone to Florida, to Orlando, for a family holiday, and my son Nate, who is 13 now, and my daughter, who's 15, they were 5, they were say 5 and 6 going on 7. And the first night we arrived in the hotel, and what I would say to you is we had traveled like Irish time. This was about, when we arrived, it was 1 o'clock in the morning, so everybody was exhausted. So we just literally checked into the hotel. We had a 1-bedroom apartment. It was like a condo, so it had a sitting room, kitchen, all in one bathroom, and 1 bedroom with 2 double beds in it. So the kids were in one bed and we were in the other bed. But like if I
Yeah.
reached my hand out, I could touch the kids. Like there was like a foot between our beds. And we just fell into bed. And then at 3 in the morning, I woke up and I could hear it banging on the front door. And so I kind of nudged my husband and I said, do you hear that? And we got up and I looked through the keyhole, nobody there, but could hear the banging. And it was just very odd. And so I went to open it and Roger was like, are you crazy? Like, we're in Florida, we're not in Wexford. Don't open the door. So he said, I'm going to ring reception. And then I just said, that's Nate. And he said, don't be ridiculous. Nate is asleep in the bed, literally in the same room as us. And I didn't think it was Amelia. It was weird, actually. But I just had this mother's instinct, which I really believe that we sometimes do. And I just said, it's Nate. And I remember just opening the door, despite Rog telling me not to. And sure enough, there was Nate. Like, he was so distraught. He was like literally sobbing his heart out. And I could, like, I fell to the ground, literally. I cannot express the horror. of seeing your child in a hotel corridor in America on his own at 3 a.m. and not knowing how he got there and why he was there and what was going on. So anyhow, when we pieced it together, what had actually happened was the first night it had happened, he sleptwalked, and he managed to, we ended up going to doctors. But anyway, kids who sleepwalk or adults who sleepwalk, you can do stuff when you sleepwalk that you'll never do when you're awake. So if you had asked him as a 5-year-old to get out of that front door, I don't think he would have been able to. But because there was a lock, like kind of, the way the American locks, there's quite a heavy lock.
Yes.
But he managed to open it and get out. Now we're tall, like I'm 5'10", we're all tall, so he's tall, so he could reach it, even though he was only 5, he could reach it because he was quite tall. But he tall for his age, I suppose. We were at the very, very end of a long corridor. And what actually helped us was that he got to the end of the corridor to the lift before he woke up. And how he woke up was the ding of he heard the lift moving. And he said he got such a fright. I mean, he's going, why am I here? Can you imagine for a 5-year-old? 1 minute you're in bed and you're literally asleep beside your mum and dad and your sister. And the next minute you're on this corridor. He was so confused. And it was his first time sleepwalking. But he remembered when we came up the lift, because we were on like the 5th floor. And when we came up the lift and we found our room, I said to the kids, we'll never forget which is our room, because it's the very last one at the end of the corridor. It was a really long, thin corridor. Think The Shining, the hotel. It was like this really long corridor. And I said, we'll just never forget it. And he said, that's what he remembered. And he went, Mammy said, it's the last room. And so he ran down the corridor really fast. And then he said he could see there were 2 rooms at the end, right and left. And he was like, on either side of the corridor, and he guessed it was the left, but he wasn't sure, and he was so relieved. He didn't know who was going to open the door. Could you imagine for him? And then I opened the door. So anyhow, we were so terrified, and I remember going down to reception, and I asked them, could I see CCTV footage, because I wanted to piece together what had happened. And there was nothing on the floor. They don't have footage on the floor. So I was going,
oh, that's comforting.
Anything. Yeah, so they did have it in the lobby, but nothing on the hotel floor. So it's like, basically the horror then is that if he'd knocked on the wrong door, if somebody had have seen him, and you've got all these things in America, like the Uber Eats, there are people delivering food to hotel rooms, couriers delivering food to hotel rooms all the time. We did it. We did the Uber Eats when we were there because, sometimes we'd come back from the parks, the kids would be tired. So you'd order an Uber Eats. And so a random guy comes on a courier bike. And so literally the horror of like anybody could have had access to it. So it was terrifying. The pool downstairs, there was no lock to the door. It was one of those automatic doors. It didn't lock at night. So if he had gone down the lift before you got to reception, the pool was on the right. And it was like, what if he'd gone out to the pool? What if he'd fallen in? So all these horrifying things meant that holiday, Nate slept with me for the whole holiday, because I would literally wrap my arms around with him every night. I didn't sleep for a fortnight. But about a week later, when I'd finished crying and terrified, Rod and I remember we were chatting about it. The kids were asleep and we were having a drink in the room, I might add, and just having a chat or whatever. And Rod said to me, if something terrible had happened and we'd woken up and Nate was just gone, right? Who would believe us that we hadn't done something to him? And I was like, you're right. The finger of suspicion would go straight to us, because no one would believe that parents could sleep through a child disappearing from their room. So they would say 100% you've done something to that child. And that's why the idea kind of came to me, because I thought to myself, okay, I began noodling the idea then, and I was going, I'd really love to explore that. So what if I write a book whereby from a very closed quarters, and I chose a cruise ship, a child disappears? The answer is not sleepwalking, just to put that out in case you think that it's not a direct, like, it's not sleepwalking, but the child disappears. But what if the reader doesn't find out until the parents do 40 years later? Wouldn't that be interesting? What happened to that child? You don't know. Did he somehow fall overboard on the ship? Did, what happened to him? Did the parents do something to him? Was there foul play? And they disposed of the body. Like, there are so many, did someone take him? So there are all sorts of reasons why something could have happened to Robert in the story. And that's what I began noodling. So the story, so it came from, as I said, a horrifying what if moment that our family had. And And we had fun for years later, actually, because he sleptwalked for years. So we would have to, every single time we went somewhere, we would have to barricade the door. If we had a balcony, we'd ask to move. We'd have a lock on, because you couldn't,
Yeah.
we were terrified. We used to put in front of the door, wherever we'd be, if there was a sofa, if there was a chair, if there was a dining room table, whatever the heaviest piece of furniture there was, we put up against the door. So we were like, even if he has extra strength, he's not going to get through that. We went to a lot of great lengths to keep him locked in, and he kind of outgrew it eventually. So it was just one of those things.
That's terrifying to be in that situation. I know that when we were younger, do you remember in Marks and Spencer's, they used to have those massive, great big round rails where they'd have all the clothes?
Yeah.
And my sister went missing when we went shopping in one of the big Marks and Spencer's. We searched. I've never forgotten my mum screaming around the shop because she couldn't find my sister anywhere. And it turned out my sister had gone and sat in the middle of one of those great big things, and because of all the clothes, she couldn't hear anything.
Oh,
but she
my
was also
God.
she also had partial hearing, so it was
Wow,
terrifying.
okay. Of course it was. Like, and that you never forget that. Like you're remembering this all these years later, and Nate will never forget that with him. Neither will Amelia, his older sister, or me or Roger. It's become one of those family moments that is discussed and kind of, and you have to kind of look, it's now inspired a book, so it's all good.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely. So it's a very intriguing book. There are so many things in here that really do make you think, and it's quite terrifying. A lot of the things occur because they are things that can really happen, rather than a dragon you're riding in the middle of nowhere. It is terrifying that these I think the issue is this does happen. Children do go missing and
they go
never
missing.
show up. And
there are unanswered questions.
Yeah, exactly. Did something happen? Did an accident occur and they covered it up by hiding the body? Was there somebody that snuck into the room? Did that occur? It is a terrifying thing. I'm so glad I don't have children, because I don't think I'd mentally be able to cope with it, to be honest.
Absolutely.
And sometimes I'm surprised at the things that parents can cope with. But I think this book does make you think about all the things that you would do in order to protect the people that you love. And I think that's a lot of what happens, especially towards the end of the book. What will do to protect the people you care about, and also protect yourself from being hurt, being exposed, revealing secrets that you really don't want anybody else to know about. It is one of those books that I think is going to make me think for quite a while. And it certainly gave me a lot to think about when I finished it, because as you read on, you think, because you have all the relationships that you build with the characters as the story builds. And yeah, I'm going to knock my microphone into my computer in a minute. It is one of those books that definitely makes you think. So I believe it's out at the end of this month.
27th of February, in hardback in the UK. And then in Ireland, we don't do hardbacks in Ireland.
Nearly payday.
So no, very, very close. And then ebook and audio as well. So however you like to read your books, it's going to be available in that format. So fantastic. I'm very excited
it's one of those books that definitely makes you think. I'd recommend parents don't read it at night, personally. And don't read it if you're going on a cruise ship with your children.
Or
don't read it while you're on the cruise ship with your children.
We do, like, as a family, myself and my husband and 2 kids, we've been on quite a few cruise ship holidays. I think we've done 4 or 5, and we love it. It's a great family holiday. So I need to say that quite clearly. I would like to say, do 100. It is a brilliant holiday, for nothing else apart from the fact that if you have fussy eaters, there is every cuisine known to man on a cruise ship, and it doesn't matter. You will find something for everyone to eat. I tell you, it's a great rest for a mother. I love cruise ships for that reason. I really feel like I've had a holiday when I go to cruise ship.
Oh yeah, but don't read it while you're on that cruise ship. It's a fantastic. I'd say it's a brilliant beach read.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, exactly.
So where can people find you on the internet, social media, website?
Yeah, I usually hang, it's only Instagram that I do, although I have an author page on Facebook, and it kind of, they are married together anyhow, so the content is kind of crossed over. So it's quite easy to find me, but I suppose if you just look for Carmel Harrington, you're going to find me. But Happy Mrs. H is my name on all platforms. So whether it's Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter, which I'm never on. So there's no real point looking for me there, but I do have a page, but I just don't really tend to be on there at all. But Instagram is my favorite place to hang out, and it's Happy Mrs. H.
Fantastic. Well, I will post the link, and I'll also post the link so people can find the book on bookshops.org and Waterstones and Amazon, of course, because I
Yes.
have to put Amazon down.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And all the links are there. And actually, on my Instagram, if you look on the bio, there's a link, there's a link tree there, and all the links to buy are there. So if you need to find it, you'll find it all there. So, um,
Fantastic.
yeah, I'm just really excited now. And, there were some nice things. Actually, this week, it's kind of the excitement is building up, and the Sunday Times chose it as a pick of the month this weekend on Sunday, and reviewed it beautifully. And it's lovely to have those kind of pre pre-release affirmations. So
Yes,
talking to someone like
absolutely.
you, and it's so lovely. So it's a gift. So that makes me feel a little bit less stressed, seeing it go out into the world. I'm just very excited now, and can't wait to hear what the readers think of it all. And I just hope everybody, if you do read it, keep the twist to yourself. Let people
Oh,
enjoy the twist when it
100%.
happens.
I think that's it. It's the twist that really brings everything together so perfectly. It reveals everything, but it also asks far more questions.
It does, yeah. And there's still, yeah, even when the twist is like, there's actually there's a reveal, as I said earlier on, halfway through, that turns everything you thought was to be true on its head. And then there's the big twist, which happens towards the end, but that's not the end of the reveals. There's still a couple more reveals to come after that. So there are multiple reveals that change the story, really, because as you said, when that big twist happens, that lends to a lot of questions. It's like, well, okay, if that's the case, what about? And then more
Yeah,
questions have to be answered,
absolutely.
really, which
Yeah, I
changes
ended up
again.
writing a few notes. I have to be honest.
Yeah, that's good. That's good, I hope.
But anyway, thank you so much for yeah, thank you so
Pleasure.
much for joining me this week and talking about your brand new book, because as I said, it's not a genre I tend to pick up very often, because I get nightmares when I read about stuff that really happens. So I'm a bit weak like that, but it has
I get
been an
it.
enjoyable read, and it is one of those books I think a lot of people are going to find different things in, whether it's the
Yeah.
stories of the different ages of the stories of the different characters growing up, or the the thriller twist and the emotional aspect. So it's definitely got something for everyone. And thank you so much for joining me. It has been wonderful talking to you about this and so many other
It's
things
a
as
pleasure.
well.
It's such a pleasure. It's just been lovely. Yeah, I feel like you and I we've a lot in common. We've a lot that we could chat about. So it was very nice
We
to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, pleasure. Thanks, Ray.
And again, a massive thank you to Carmel Harrington for talking with me about her brand new book, The Stolen Child, released on the 27th of February, which is coming really soon if you're listening to this on release date. Thank you so much for listening. I will be back again in 2 weeks with another brand new book review. And in the meantime, if you want to find me on socials, you can find me on Insta at Being Bookish Pod, on TikTok as Being Bookish Reviews, and I have actually been releasing content there of late, on X or Twitter as Being_Bookish, and you can find episodes and video reviews of books and book genres on my YouTube channel, which you can find as at Being Bookish Pod or Ray Loves Reading. Thank you so much for joining me and Carmel to talk about her brand new book. definitely go out and buy it if you love emotional thrillers, and even if you don't and it's a new genre to you, give it a try because it is a good book to read. And I will speak to you again soon. Farewell.